They arrived expecting pain, punishment, and something violent to happen immediately because nothing in their experience had prepared them for mercy or calm. What unsettled them was not what they saw, but what did not happen because no one shouted, no one rushed them, and no clear threat appeared. Instead, there was only waiting, and the longer that silence stretched, the more it began to feel deliberate, controlled, and possibly dangerous. The moment they were taken from the transport did not feel like the beginning of captivity, because nothing about it resembled what they had been taught to expect. There were no shouted orders that carried rage in their tone, no hurried movements meant to intimidate, and no visible punishment waiting to make an example of them. Only a sequence of calm instructions delivered without emphasis, as if the situation itself required no performance at all. This absence of immediate force created a strange imbalance, because preparation for suffering is easier than confronting uncertainty, and uncertainty was now everywhere. They were led through spaces that felt deliberately ordinary, paths between wooden buildings, open yards without crowds, and fences that marked boundaries without drama, all of it quiet enough that individual footsteps could be heard on the ground. The men noticed details they had not expected to notice, such as the spacing between the barracks, the way guards stood without gripping their weapons, and the fact that no one seemed to be watching them closely enough to provoke fear, which only deepened their unease. When a system does not announce itself, the mind begins to search for what it cannot see. Time passed without explanation, not in minutes that could be counted, but in long stretches where nothing happened at all, and this lack of direction forced them inward. Some stood, others sat where they were told, and a few simply remained still, waiting for a signal that never came, because waiting itself had become the structure. In this suspended state, memory began to intrude, bringing back expectations formed long before capture, expectations shaped by instruction, belief, and fear, all of which now felt incompatible with what surrounded them. Food was eventually placed nearby, not presented ceremoniously and not forced upon anyone, simply left within reach, and this gesture was perhaps more unsettling than violence would have been. Several men avoided it entirely, not because they were not hungry, but because accepting it felt premature, as if eating might signal agreement with something they did not yet understand. Hunger was familiar, but this situation was not, and familiarity mattered more than comfort in those first hours. Sleep did not come easily that night, even though nothing prevented it physically, because rest requires a sense of predictability, and predictability was absent. The environment was quiet enough to hear distant movement, but not loud enough to identify it, and the mind filled that space with imagined possibilities, rehearsing scenarios that never arrived. Every sound felt delayed, every moment stretched, and without clear rules, the simplest actions became uncertain. What they could not yet articulate, but already felt deeply, was that captivity here did not rely on spectacle or intimidation, but on something slower and more corrosive. By removing immediate threat, the situation demanded constant interpretation, and interpretation is exhausting when there is no confirmation to be found. In this place, the absence of cruelty did not create relief, but tension, because it suggested intention without revealing purpose. By the end of that first period, which could not be measured accurately by clocks or schedules, many of them understood that whatever awaited them would not arrive suddenly. It would unfold gradually, through routine, through silence, and through the steady realization that nothing was being hidden, yet nothing was being explained. And in that realization, the first cracks began to form, not in the body, but in expectation itself. If you'd like to hear future stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel. As the first days passed, The prisoners began to notice that the camp did not behave the way fear had prepared them for. Nothing dramatic announced itself, and nothing sudden forced a reaction, because the environment seemed designed to continue rather than explode. The buildings stood in fixed positions, the paths between them were used the same way each day, and the guards moved according to schedules that repeated without urgency, creating a sense that time here was meant to be managed, not consumed in chaos. This stability was not comforting, because comfort implies safety, and safety was something they could not trust. Their expectations had been shaped by years of instruction and belief, all of it reinforcing the idea that surrender erased a man's value completely. They had been told that capture meant disgrace, cruelty, and a rapid descent into humiliation, and they carried those expectations with them when they entered the camp. Yet what they encountered instead was routine, and routine forced the mind to think further ahead than fear prefers. When violence is immediate, survival becomes simple, because every decision is reduced to endurance. But when life continues in an organized way, questions begin to form about duration, meaning, and what comes after. The camp operated with rules that were firm but impersonal, and this impersonality was difficult to interpret. Roll calls happened at the same times, food arrived without ceremony, and instructions were delivered without raised voices, as if emotion itself had been removed from the process. The prisoners noticed that nothing here appeared designed to provoke reaction, which made it harder to locate the threat they believed must exist. If punishment did not arrive immediately, then it might arrive later, and that delay created a different kind of tension, one that settled slowly instead of striking all at once. Suspicion filled the space where certainty should have been. Some men refused to eat at first, not because the food was insufficient, but because accepting it felt like stepping into an agreement they did not understand. Others watched the guards closely, searching for signs of deception in posture and expression, assuming that calm behavior must conceal harsher intentions. Every small gesture became something to be analyzed, because analysis was the only way to regain a sense of control in an environment that revealed so little of its purpose. What troubled them most was the sense that the camp assumed continuity. Beds were assigned as if sleep would matter tomorrow. Supplies were distributed as if weeks were expected to follow, and records were kept with care, suggesting that this situation was not temporary in the way they had imagined. This implied future unsettled them, because their understanding of honor and duty had not prepared them to exist in a suspended state where survival was expected but direction was absent. As days blended together, the prisoners began to feel a growing distance from the war itself. The urgency that had once defined their lives was replaced by waiting, and the absence of information made it difficult to know whether battles were still being fought, whether homes still existed in the same form, or whether the world they remembered was already changing without them. This separation from events created a quiet unease, because it suggested that history was continuing elsewhere. While they remained fixed inside a routine they could neither influence nor escape. The camp did not attack them directly, but it challenged their sense of identity by allowing too much time for reflection. With nothing immediate to resist, the mind turned inward, replaying beliefs that no longer fit the situation. Questions surfaced without answers, and the longer those questions remained unresolved, the heavier they became. Fear did not disappear, but it transformed, shifting away from physical harm and towards something less visible, the possibility that waiting itself was slowly altering who they were. By the end of this period, many understood that captivity here would not announce its impact loudly. It would work quietly, through repetition, through predictability, and through the steady awareness that life beyond the wire continued forward, even as their own lives remained paused. This realization did not bring panic, but it marked the beginning of a deeper strain, one that would not break suddenly, but would instead press inward over time, shaping thoughts, expectations, and the fragile sense of self they were struggling to preserve. As routine settled more deeply into daily life, silence began to take on a different meaning inside the camp. At first, it had been confusing, then unsettling, but now it became something heavier, a constant presence that followed the prisoners through every part of the day. Without shouting, without visible cruelty, and without clear emotional signals from those in control, the environment offered no release for tension, and tension that cannot be released does not disappear, it accumulates. The quiet did not calm the mind. It demanded attention, forcing each man to sit with his own thoughts longer than he ever had before. In the absence of constant external threat, the prisoners became more aware of time itself. Days were no longer marked by danger, but by repetition, and repetition has a way of eroding resistance slowly. Morning followed night with little distinction. Meals arrived on schedule, and instructions rarely changed, creating a sense that the camp was designed to function indefinitely. This endurance of structure suggested that nothing would arrive suddenly to resolve their situation, and that realization began to wear on them more than fear ever had. Conversation became cautious, not because speech was forbidden, but because words carried weight in an environment where nothing else seemed to move. Some men spoke less, choosing silence as a form of self-protection, while others repeated the same stories from before capture, not to inform, but to remind themselves that a past still existed. Over time, even these conversations thinned, as repetition drained them of comfort and familiarity turned into fatigue. Silence returned, filling the spaces between people as effectively as the fences filled the space around them. The mind, deprived of urgency, began to wander in uncomfortable directions. Thoughts drifted toward home, toward moments left unfinished, toward questions that could not be answered from inside the camp. Without new information, imagination took control, constructing futures that were either too hopeful to trust or too bleak to confront. This internal movement created a quiet instability, because while the body remained contained, the mind moved constantly, searching for something solid to hold on to. Some prisoners attempted to impose order on themselves by clinging to personal routines, walking the same paths at the same times, arranging their belongings with care, or marking days in subtle ways that no one else could see. These small acts provided a sense of agency, but they also highlighted how little control remained, because every routine existed within larger boundaries that could not be changed. The contrast between personal effort and institutional control became more apparent, reinforcing the feeling that individual will was slowly being absorbed by the environment. The silence also altered how authority was perceived. Guards did not need to raise their voices or display force, because the system itself carried authority through consistency. This lack of visible aggression made resistance feel undefined, because there was nothing obvious to resist. When power operates quietly, it becomes harder to locate, and without a clear target, frustration turns inward. Over time, this inward pressure began to affect posture, speech, and behavior, as men adjusted themselves to a space where emotional expression seemed unnecessary or even inappropriate. As weeks passed, the prisoners noticed changes that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Time felt slower, decisions felt less important, and emotional reactions softened, not out of peace, but out of fatigue. The absence of dramatic events created a flatness that dulled both fear and hope, leaving something neutral in their place. This neutrality was not relief. but a form of mental compression where extremes faded and everything settled into the same muted tone. What made this process especially difficult was that it happened without clear warning. There was no moment that signaled a turning point, no single event to point to as the cause, only the gradual realization that something inside them was shifting. Silence had stopped being empty and had become active, shaping thoughts, slowing reactions, and narrowing the focus of attention. In a place where nothing seemed to happen, something fundamental was changing. By the end of this phase, the prisoners understood that captivity did not always break a person through force or deprivation. Sometimes it worked by removing stimulation, by controlling rhythm, and by allowing the mind to exhaust itself against an unchanging environment. The silence, once confusing, had become the mechanism itself, and within it, the pressure continued to build, not loudly or violently, but steadily, preparing the ground for deeper changes that had yet to reveal themselves. As the weeks extended into something harder to define, the prisoners began to notice that the camp was no longer something they were merely inside of, but something that was slowly shaping how they understood themselves. At first, identity had felt intact, anchored in rank, memory, and the story each man carried about who he had been before capture. Those stories had provided structure, a way to remain connected to a version of life that still felt real. But repetition has a quiet way of softening edges, and over time, those internal narratives began to lose clarity. The absence of meaningful choice played a significant role in this shift. Decisions were small and predictable, limited to when to stand, where to sit, and how to pass the hours between scheduled moments. Without opportunities to exercise judgment or initiative, the sense of individual distinction began to fade. Men who had once defined themselves through responsibility and action now existed within a system that required neither, and this gradual removal of personal agency altered how they perceived their own importance. Names were still spoken, but less often. Numbers, lists, and positions became more relevant than personal histories, and while this structure was efficient, it subtly reduced the need for individual recognition. Over time, some prisoners responded by withdrawing inward, conserving energy and emotion, while others attempted to maintain identity through repetition of past roles, correcting others on small details or insisting on protocols that no longer carried practical meaning. These efforts were not about control over the camp, but about control over the self. The past, once a source of strength, began to feel distant. Memories surfaced less frequently and with less emotional intensity, as if the mind were protecting itself by dulling connections that could not be acted upon. Home, family, and former purpose remained present, but they no longer felt immediate, and this distance created a subtle sense of unreality. It was not that the prisoners forgot who they had been, but that those versions of themselves no longer felt fully accessible. Social dynamics within the camp also shifted as identity thinned. Small hierarchies formed based on adaptability rather than rank, favoring those who adjusted more easily to routine and silence. Men who struggled to reconcile their self-image with captivity often found themselves isolated, not through exclusion, but through quiet divergence. Conversations became shorter, gestures simpler, and emotional expression more restrained, as if the collective tone of the camp were slowly flattening. This flattening did not erase personality, but it compressed it. Strong reactions became rare, not because feelings disappeared, but because expressing them seemed unnecessary in an environment that did not respond. Over time, even internal reactions softened, creating a sense of emotional neutrality that felt safer than sustained tension. The camp did not demand emotional surrender, but it offered few reasons to maintain intensity, and without reinforcement, intensity naturally faded. What unsettled many prisoners was the realization that this change was not forced. No one instructed them to feel less, to remember less, or to define themselves differently. The process unfolded quietly, through adaptation rather than confrontation. Each adjustment made sense on its own, but together they formed a gradual transformation that was difficult to reverse once noticed. Identity, it seemed, did not disappear suddenly, but thinned slowly, becoming lighter and less defined with each passing day. By this stage, the prisoners were not simply enduring captivity, they were being reshaped by it. The camp had become a place where survival no longer required constant alertness, but where maintaining a sense of self required deliberate effort. Some managed this through internal discipline, others through detachment, but for many, the boundary between who they had been and who they were becoming grew increasingly blurred. As this phase settled in, a quiet understanding emerged that the greatest challenge ahead would not be physical endurance, but the ability to recognize oneself after prolonged waiting. The camp continued unchanged, but within it, the prisoners felt a subtle shift, as if something essential were being stretched thinner each day, preparing them for a final realization that had not yet fully taken shape, but was steadily approaching. By the time the prisoners reached this stage, waiting had stopped feeling temporary and had become something closer to a condition, a way of existing rather than a pause between events. The camp no longer felt new or confusing, and it no longer demanded constant interpretation, because its structure had become familiar enough to fade into the background. This familiarity did not bring comfort, but it removed urgency, and without urgency, the mind began to drift into a state where days blended together without distinction. Time still passed, but it did so quietly, without markers strong enough to hold on to. What unsettled them most was not the lack of freedom, but the absence of a clear direction forward. In the early days, captivity had been framed internally as something to survive until an endpoint arrived, but now that endpoint felt undefined. The war continued somewhere beyond the fences, yet information arrived slowly and without certainty, making it difficult to imagine a moment when normal life would resume. Without a visible future to prepare for, planning lost its meaning, and without planning, motivation thinned. Some prisoners tried to hold on to hope by setting small goals, counting days, marking seasons, or imagining return scenarios in careful detail, but these mental exercises gradually lost their strength. Each imagined future required assumptions they could not verify, and over time, imagining became tiring rather than sustaining. Others chose the opposite approach, avoiding thoughts of what might come next entirely, focusing instead on the present moment as a way to reduce disappointment. This narrowing of attention provided short-term relief, but also reduced emotional range, leaving little room for anticipation or aspiration. The camp itself reinforced this state by continuing unchanged. The same routines repeated, the same spaces were occupied, and the same schedules guided movement, creating the impression that life here was self-contained. This stability suggested permanence, even if no one said it aloud, and permanence made the idea of return feel abstract. The longer the environment remained consistent, the harder it became to imagine re-entering a world that functioned differently, where choices mattered and time moved unpredictably. Relationships within the camp adjusted accordingly. Conversations turned away from the future and focused instead on immediate observations or shared memories that no longer required projection. Laughter, when it appeared, was brief and quiet, not because joy was forbidden, but because sustaining it felt out of place in an environment defined by waiting. Emotional expression became economical, conserving energy in a space where nothing demanded a response beyond compliance. The greatest change, however, occurred internally. Many prisoners noticed that they no longer measured themselves against who they had been before capture, but against who they were able to be within the camp. Success became defined by adaptation rather than achievement, by endurance rather than progress. This shift did not feel like surrender, but it carried a subtle cost, because adapting too completely risked erasing the desire for something beyond the present structure. As weeks turned into months, the idea of the future became less specific. Instead of imagining detailed outcomes, prisoners spoke in general terms, if they spoke of it at all, using language that avoided commitment. This vagueness protected them from disappointment, but it also removed a source of psychological momentum. Without a future to lean toward, time lost its forward pull, and waiting became circular, repeating itself without clear advancement. By this point, captivity was no longer experienced as a series of hardships, but as an extended stillness. The absence of dramatic suffering did not lessen its impact, because the true weight of the experience lay in its duration and predictability. Waiting without a future asked something different of the human mind, requiring it to exist without anticipation, to remain present without purpose, and to endure continuity without progress. As this realization settled in, the prisoners reached a quiet threshold. They were no longer reacting to captivity, and they were no longer resisting it actively, but they were also not fully at peace with it. Instead, they occupied a narrow space between acceptance and detachment, where survival depended on maintaining balance rather than striving for resolution. Beyond this point, something would have to change, either in circumstance or within themselves, because waiting without a future could not remain neutral forever, and the mind, left suspended for too long, inevitably begins to reshape its understanding of time, self, and meaning. When the end of captivity eventually approached, it did not arrive with the clarity or relief the prisoners might once have imagined. There was no single moment that restored what had been suspended, no clear signal that waiting had served its purpose, because the waiting itself had already reshaped how time was understood. By then, the camp was no longer simply a place they occupied, but a rhythm they had adapted to, and stepping away from it required an adjustment just as difficult as entering it had been. The idea of release, once distant and abstract, began to take shape slowly, filtered through partial information and cautious expectation. Some men struggled to believe it at all, because certainty had been absent for so long that disbelief felt safer. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.